Pablo Andres Cardenas was 29 years old and had a look that did not match his age. There was something in his eyes that spoke of defeats before their time, of crumpled dreams like the clothes he could barely afford to wash. He lived with his mother in a humble neighborhood of Villavicencio in the department of Meta, Colombia. She, Doña Claribel, suffered from severe osteoarthritis in her hands and could no longer work cleaning houses as she had done all her life. Pablo had tried everything: temporary jobs, street vending, even carrying bundles in the central supply, but it was not enough. It never was. One night in August, while his mother slept on the couch with the TV on, Pablo locked himself in the small bathroom of the house and began to cry silently. He had no one to turn to for help. There was no family outside, no contacts, no future there. It was that very night that he made the decision. He would leave. He would do whatever it took, even if he had to risk his life. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about giving his mother something better before it was too late. If you like interesting stories, leave your like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to keep you updated with all our content. And let us know in the comments where you are watching this video from. We'd love to know. The first option was to do it right. He tried to get a visa to the United States, but the requirements, the cost, the wait, everything seemed designed to keep him out. For weeks he checked forums, groups on social networks, listened to stories of other migrants. Finally, he connected with someone, Julian, an old acquaintance from the neighborhood who was now supposedly living in Dallas, Texas. Julian promised him work, a room to stay, and above all, a helping hand when he arrived. The offer sounded too good. But Pablo no longer had room for distrust. He sold the motorcycle that he had barely finished paying for, pawned a gold chain that had been his father's, and scraped together what he could. The rest he borrowed at interest. He knew he could not pay back if he failed. When he finally had what he needed, he bought a ticket to the Mexican border via Cucuta. From there, he would continue overland. The crossing was illegal, yes, but it was the only way left. His mother knew nothing until the day he left. "Where are you going with that backpack, Pablo?" Doña Claribel asked, surprised to see him leave so early. "I'm going to Bogotá to look for a job. Mom, a real one. I'll call you as soon as I get there." She looked at him with that mixture of pride and fear that only a mother knows. She did not insist. Maybe she knew it was a lie, or maybe she preferred to believe it. She hugged him tightly, as if she sensed that this goodbye could last longer than the heart could bear. The journey was harder than he expected. For 5 days, Pablo crossed dangerous territories, slept in abandoned houses, walked long distances under the hot sun of northern Mexico, and paid people who did not even deign to look him in the eye. Finally, he managed to cross the Rio Bravo with a group of migrants guided by a coyote. The following hours were a mixture of fear, nervousness, and absolute silence. When he finally stepped on U.S. soil, he felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The plan was clear: call Julian, meet him in El Paso, and from there go together to Dallas. But the phone he had been given to communicate with his contact had no signal. He turned it on and off several times. He tried moving the chip. He waited. Nothing. He spent a night hiding in the bushes, fearing to be discovered by the border patrol. At dawn, he arrived as best he could in a small town nearby and gained access to Wi-Fi at a convenience store. He sent messages, tried to call. Julian never answered. Days passed and his hope began to fade. Alone, with no money, no papers, and no one waiting for him, Pablo began to walk. He arrived at a bus station, asked for a big city where he could have better opportunities, but the little he had was not even enough for a local ticket. It was then that, defeated, he ended up sleeping the next 4 nights in the parking lot of a 7-Eleven. That's where the real hell would begin. The air was dry, dense. The heat during the day burned the skin. But when night fell, The cold got into the bones. Pablo had settled into a dark corner of the parking lot of a 7-Eleven on the outskirts of El Paso, Texas. He had no coat, only a worn sweatshirt, the same one he had crossed the border with, already stained with dirt and sweat. He slept huddled between a wall and a dumpster, with his backpack hugged to his chest as if it could protect him from reality. The first night passed unnoticed, exhausted. The second was different. He began to feel the hunger, a constant pang, empty, that made him ache even the ideas. He had not eaten since the day before, and what little he had, a packet of cookies that a woman had given him at the border, he had already finished. He dared to enter the store once, but the clerks, nervous at the sight of his appearance, looked at him as if he were a thief. He said nothing. He just left. On the third night, desperation pushed him to rummage through the trash cans behind the store. He found a box of leftover cold pizza and a half-finished glass of soda. It wasn't dignity that stopped him. It was fear. Fear of getting sick, of being arrested, of disappearing without anyone knowing his name. But the stomach does not understand pride. He ate in silence, with his hands shaking. On the fourth day, the sky dawned overcast. There was an icy wind that cut. Pablo wrapped himself as best he could in a piece of dirty tarpaulin he had found nearby. By this time, he no longer expected Julian to answer. He was convinced that he had been tricked or that he had just been abandoned. Sometimes he would turn on his cell phone just to look at the screen, even if he had no signal, not a call, not a message, not a reply, just silence. It was then when he met Veronica, one of the employees of the 7-Eleven. She saw him from the window while she was sweeping the entrance. At first, she said nothing, just watched him. The next day, she came out with a hot coffee and left it on the sidewalk, pretending it was not for him. Pablo waited for her to come in again and, with embarrassment, took the cup in his hands as if it were liquid gold. "Thank you," he murmured softly, not knowing if she heard him. Soon after, another young woman, Luz Maria, also approached with a bag of sweet bread. They both worked different shifts, but they had already realized that this young man was not dangerous. He didn't look like a bum or a drug addict. He had the face of someone lost, broken, like someone who just wanted something, no matter how small, to go right for once in his life. At the end of the day, the two sat in the back of the store, pretending they were on their break, and began to talk to him. "What is your name?" asked Luz Maria, in a soft voice. Pablo Cardenas." "And what are you doing here, Pablo?" He looked down. He didn't know where to start. But he started. He said that he came from Colombia, that he had crossed the desert, that he was looking for a certain Julian who never arrived, that he had nowhere to go. "And you have no family here?" "No one. I am alone." Veronica looked at him with a mixture of compassion and pain. They didn't know how to help him. They didn't have many resources. But they knew one thing. If he stayed there any longer, something bad would happen to him. The local police used to hang around, and it was not uncommon for people to disappear without a trace, especially migrants. That night, after leaving the shift, both women made a decision. They scraped together some money between them, talked to a friend who worked at the bus terminal, and bought a ticket to New York. They said that she might be luckier there, that there were more opportunities and more support networks for immigrants. They couldn't do more, but at least they were giving him a destination, a chance. "It's not much, but there may be someone there to lend you a hand," said Veronica as she handed him the ticket. "I don't know how to thank them for this," Pablo replied, his voice breaking. "You don't have to thank me for anything. Just go ahead." The next morning, Pablo got on a bus headed for John F. Kennedy International Airport, not knowing exactly what he was waiting for. Kennedy International Airport, not knowing exactly what awaited him there. He had no one, no address, no plan, only minimal hope, and that was more than he had had in days. The bus ride was long, More than 40 hours crossing states, grey stations, endless roads and landscapes that told him nothing. Paul knew no one at any point on the map. He was dozing with his head against the window, hugging his backpack as if he was carrying more than 2 shirts, a pair of pants, and the phone off that was already just a reminder of the deception. During the ride, he barely ate. He had a package of sweetbread that Veronica and Luz Maria had given him, and a bottle of water. He administered them as if they were the last things in the world. At every stop, he got off to stretch his legs, but he never left the bus. He was afraid of being left behind, of losing what little direction he had. In his pocket, he kept the ticket with the address of the final destination, John F. Kennedy International Airport, New York. That was his new starting point, even if he had no idea what he would do once there. When he finally arrived, the first thing he felt was the change in the air, the cold. It wasn't the same dry cold of the Texan desert. It was a damp cold that crept in, chilling him to the bone. He had no coat. I had no plans. He just had a feeling he couldn't give up just yet. He walked through the aisles of the airport, confused, dazed by the constant movement of people, English announcements he didn't quite understand, and white lights that made him feel even smaller. He looked for a secluded corner behind a column near the international arrivals area and plopped down with his back against the wall. He didn't know if he could sleep there, but he had no choice. No one was waiting for him outside. No one was waiting for him anywhere. The first night at JFK was brutal. He couldn't sleep. He was awakened by loudspeaker announcements, the comings and goings of passengers, and the constant vigilance of security guards. On several occasions, he was forced to move. Pablo pretended that he was waiting for a flight, that he was late, that his family was coming for him. No one believed him at all, but they didn't take him out either. At least not that time. The next day, he looked for another corner, a more hidden one in an area near the bathrooms on the lower level. There he found a space between 2 vending machines where the noise was constant, but no one took too much notice. He used cardboard boxes he found in a dumpster to improvise a bed. A cleaning lady gave him a thin blanket, one of those left by passengers on airplanes. He thanked her as if she had given him a house. During the day, he walked the aisles like a ghost. He watched people with expensive suitcases, with clean clothes, with families who laughed and hugged when they met again. It hurt to watch. It hurt him more than hunger. He would go to the fast food area, not to eat, but to check the trash cans when no one was watching. Sometimes he would find a piece of unfinished hamburger, a drink with melted ice, an open bag of chips. He learned to pretend to eat while charging his cell phone with public outlets. The phone still had no signal, but turning it on gave him a false sense of control. Days passed. 1, 2, 5. He no longer counted them. He slept little, ate less. The cold was getting harder as night fell. His body began to ache from sleeping on the floor. The cement was merciless, feet swollen, ankles numb. But the worst part was the uncertainty. Not knowing how much longer he could last like this, Pablo thought about going back, about turning himself in to the immigration authorities. He thought about looking for a Colombian consulate, asking for help, going back. But every time he thought about it, he remembered his mother's face, the cracked house, the meager dinner, the hands deformed by the disease. To return with nothing was like killing her in life. So she resisted, not knowing for how long. She just held on. The day Paul arrived in New York was the beginning of an existence that even in his worst nightmares he had never imagined. He arrived with his backpack hanging from one shoulder, his body sore from the bus ride and his mind clouded by uncertainty. John F. Kennedy International Airport was not a destination, but a gap between 2 worlds. The one he left behind in Colombia and the one he could not yet reach. The terminal greeted him with its constant noise, suitcases rolling, endless announcements in English, automatic doors that opened and closed without rest. Voices that came and went without noticing anyone. It was a place without night or day, without pauses, without a human face. Paul sat on one of the benches in the arrivals area, staring at the floor, wondering how long he could stay there without being noticed. He spent the first few hours exploring. He walked around the terminals looking for information, a less exposed place, some corner where he could close his eyes without being kicked out. He noticed that on the lower level, near the old toilets, there were quieter spaces. There, among vending machines and forgotten luggage lockers, he found his temporary shelter. It was neither comfortable nor safe, but at least no one bothered him. For now. When night fell, he curled up on the floor with his head resting on his backpack. The cold was different from Texas. Damp, constant, penetrating. It enveloped him relentlessly. The old sweatshirt he wore was useless. His teeth chattered involuntarily, and he wondered if he would get to sleep or if this would be his last night alive. But the fatigue was too much. He closed his eyes without realizing it and plunged into a broken sleep, interrupted by loudspeakers, footsteps, the cries of children, the rattle of the wheels of suitcases. At dawn, he was awakened by a maintenance worker who inadvertently swept next to his back. Pablo got up suddenly, embarrassed, and walked away without anyone saying anything. He spent all that day walking around the airport, watching people eating, talking on cell phones, complaining about delays. He was a mute spectator of the world of others. I was not part of anything. As the days went by, he developed a survival instinct he didn't know he had. He discovered what times were best to check the dumpsters without being seen, and learned to recognize closed or leftover containers that were still edible. He was becoming more and more skilled, more careful. He no longer walked as a newcomer, but as someone who knew how to go unnoticed. Sometimes, as he discreetly checked an abandoned tray or a freshly changed garbage bag, he would encounter fleeting glances, gestures of revulsion, or simple, averted eyes. Most people pretended not to see him. To many, he was nothing more than a shadow, an uncomfortable presence. The routine was cruel, sleeping during the day in hidden places, walk aimlessly through the terminals so as not to look suspicious, search for food, avoiding security, and above all, avoid thinking too much. When he did, when he stopped to imagine what he might be doing in Colombia, or what his mother thought about not hearing from him, a fierce anguish filled his chest. One day, while hiding between two columns behind a closed cafeteria, Pablo felt his body begin to weaken. He found it hard to get up. His throat felt dry, his legs heavy, his lips cracked. It had been more than 3 days since he had eaten anything solid. He had only had leftover drinks and a couple of chewed apples he found on a tray. Hunger was no longer just a feeling. It was a constant fog in his head. It was in that state, trembling with weakness, that he met Marta, a Mexican woman who worked cleaning toilets on the early shift. She saw him cowering behind a vending machine, staring blankly. She didn't ask any questions. She approached him cautiously, took out of her purse a pan de dulce and a coffee wrapped in a paper bag, and set it down next to him. "It's hot. Don't get sick," she said quietly, without lingering to wait for an answer. Pablo looked at her with tears in his eyes. That gesture, so simple, broke his soul. He nodded his head, murmuring a thank you that was barely heard. It was the first time in days that someone treated him as a person. Since that day, Marta appeared a couple more times, always discreetly. Sometimes she would leave him some food. Sometimes she would just greet him with her eyes. She never insisted, never questioned him. It was as if she knew that in Pablo's life there was no room for explanations. But not everyone was like her. A security agent woke him up one night in the worst way. Pablo was sleeping in a hidden corner near the escalator when he felt a boot hit him on the leg. "Get up! You can't stay here. I'm just resting." Please, as this is not a hotel, next time you'll be arrested." There was no compassion in his eyes. Pablo got up as best he could, without protest, and dragged his backpack to another corner. That night, he did not sleep. He walked endlessly through the corridors, his eyes burning and his body growing weaker and weaker. He was beginning to accept a brutal truth. He could die there, alone, in silence, without anyone knowing his name. In the midst of that darkness, every night, he tried to think of something to keep him going. His mother, Doña Claribel's face, her voice, soft, telling him that everything would be worth it. That was the only thing that still sustained him. Because as long as he had the strength to breathe, Pablo would not give up. Not after all he had left behind, not after having come this far. One morning, after spending another sleepless night, Pablo woke up with a dry mouth, heavy head, and a sharp discomfort in the lower abdomen. His body was already beginning to feel the punishment of malnutrition, the constant cold and lack of rest. When he saw himself in the reflection of the glass of a closed store inside the airport, he did not even recognize himself. His eyes, once full of restlessness, were now two dark, empty wells. He decided then that he could not go on like this. It was no longer a matter of enduring, but of surviving. If he didn't do something, his body would simply shut down. So, that same morning, he waited for the sun to rise and shyly approached the customer information desk. He asked a young woman with a local accent if she knew of any place where he could get help. The woman looked at him with some suspicion. It was not uncommon for people like him to show up, asking for help, trying to calm a situation that they did not even know how to explain clearly. However, she gave him a card with the name of an agency, NYC Emergency Management, located in Brooklyn. As she explained to him, that institution worked with services for homeless and vulnerable people. Pablo kept the card as if it were a passport. That night, he slept little, but for the first time in days, he felt a little hope. The next day, he used the last of his energy to plan his departure. He walked for almost an hour to a nearby subway station. He had no money to pay the fare, but he saw a group of people crossing through an open side door. He mimicked their movements and entered undetected. He sat in the carriage with his heart in his throat, fearing that he would be discovered. But no one looked at him. He was just another dirty, tired face among many. The ride to Brooklyn was long. The stations passed slowly, and Paul clung to the wagon tube as if it were his only support. When he arrived, he found a different city. The streets were dirtier, the traffic denser, and the cold more aggressive. He walked with slow steps to the address noted on the card. When he saw the building with the New York Emergency Management Agency sign, he felt he had reached a place where, at last, someone would listen to him. He entered with his body hunched over, his hands in his pockets and his voice trembling. "Good morning. They told me that here they help people like me." The receptionist looked at him without expression. She asked him to wait. After almost 40 minutes sitting in an unheated room, a man with glasses and a folder in his hand called his name. He took him to a small interview room. There Pablo explained everything, how he arrived in the country, how he was abandoned, how he had been living for weeks at the airport. He spoke of his mother, of hunger, of fear, of cold. Each word weighed on him like a brick, but he did not stop talking. It was his only chance. The man listened in silence, took notes, and at the end told him in a monotone voice, "Mr. Cardenas, I understand your situation, but unfortunately, you do not qualify for any of our programs." Pablo blinked, not understanding. "What do you mean I don't qualify? I have nowhere to sleep, I have no food, I have nothing." "The problem is your immigration status. We only serve legal residents or citizens. For cases like yours, there are no resources allocated at this time, but you can't even give me a place to stay for the night. I'm sorry. Maybe some shelter in Manhattan can help you, but they are overcrowded and require certain documentation. I recommend you to contact the consulate of your country." Pablo did not answer. He stood still for a few seconds, as if the air had disappeared from the room. Then, without saying anything, he got up and left the building. Outside, a gust of icy wind hit him in the face. He felt his whole body stiffen, not only because of the cold, but because of the hopelessness that crushed him. He sat down on a rusty bench in front of a closed newspaper stand and rested his forehead on his hands. He did not cry. He had no more tears. What he felt had no form. It was an emptiness that swallowed everything, even the pain. He spent the rest of the day walking through streets he didn't know, avoiding people, dodging the gaze of policemen. He had failed. Once again, the world closed its doors without explanation. At nightfall, he took the subway back to the airport. This time, he didn't even feel fear as he slipped through the service door. He had crossed the line where fear no longer matters. If you are enjoying this story, leave your like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to keep you updated with all our content. When he arrived at JFK, he no longer sought his usual corner. He walked to a less busy terminal, sat on the floor, and leaned against the wall. No blanket, no food, no nothing. In his mind, the only phrase that kept repeating itself was, "They don't want me anywhere." And in that bitter silence, Paul began to think that maybe the real mistake was to have dreamed of a better life. The days following the failure at the aid agency were the longest of his entire life. Pablo no longer counted time in hours or days. He measured it in pieces of bread found, in minutes of heat when the sun shone through the windows of the airport. In the few seconds of peace he felt when he managed to close his eyes without being woken up. He had stopped looking for exits. He no longer spoke to anyone. He had become part of the airport landscape, like the empty chairs or the advertisements that were repeated without pause. Nobody noticed him. No one recognized him. He was a man without a voice, without a shadow, without a past. Hunger had settled as a living presence. It haunted him even when he slept. Every time he found something to eat, no matter how small it was, a bitten apple, a piece of moldy bread, a glass of leftover cold coffee. He chewed it slowly, trying to trick his body into believing it was enough, but it wasn't. His stomach no longer roared. It ached silently, like a dry echo that never died down. The cold, for its part, was unforgiving. The nights went on forever. Sleeping on the icy tile floor was like lying on a concrete slab in the open. His clothes, already dirty and worn out, offered no real protection. He wore newspaper inside his sweatshirt to try to insulate the wind. Sometimes I would find thin blankets abandoned by passengers, but they were always removed by the cleaning staff before dawn. It became a habit that at 3 o'clock in the morning, as if it were an agreed routine, some security agent would pass by to tell him that he should move, and he would do it, without protest. Without saying a word, his body began to change. He lost weight quickly, his cheeks sagged, his eyes lost their luster, his lips cracked and bled often. Every time he looked at himself in a reflection in a glass door or in the steel of a coffee machine, he wondered if he was still him. He looked like someone else, someone defeated, someone the world had forgotten. Loneliness also took its toll. He hadn't spoken to anyone for days. He had had no human contact beyond a couple of fleeting gestures, a look of sympathy, a nod of the head, a quick word of "excuse me" when someone bumped into him without seeing him. Sometimes he would sit near the boarding gates and listen to other people's conversations just to feel like he was still part of something. He pretended they were talking to him, that those happy voices were familiar, that they were waiting for him somewhere else. One afternoon, as he was checking the leftover food on an empty table in the food court, a young Hispanic female employee watched him from afar. She seemed about to say something, but didn't. She merely left a tray with an untouched hamburger and a bottle of water on a nearby table before returning to her station. Paul understood the gesture, approached sheepishly, took the food and walked away. There were no words, just a respectful silence that hurt as much as a conversation. That meal was the first decent one in almost a week. He ate it in parts, like a ritual. First the bread, then the meat, then the cheese. He savored it as if it were a feast. That night, he slept with a full stomach for the first time in days, and that allowed him, if only for a couple of hours, to dream. He dreamed of his mother, of their backyard, of the lentil and rice lunches he so despised as a teenager. In the dream, his mother hugged him and told him that everything was going to be all right, that he was going to get out of it, that he should not give up. But when he woke up, the only thing he had in his hands was an empty cardboard box that he used as a pillow. The cold was still there. The loneliness was still there. And the world, he still didn't see it. After more than 20 days living in the airport, Pablo was no longer the same. Not only on the outside, though his face was haggard, his clothes hung on his body as if they belonged to someone else, and he walked hunched over like an old man, but on the inside, something in him had broken, not once, but several times. By now he had stopped expecting anything good to happen. Everything he once believed about the United States, the opportunities, the work, the possibility of sending money to his mother, the dignity of earning a living by the sweat of his brow, had become a cruel irony. The country he dreamed of was a mirage, and the place where he lived now, that huge and cold airport, was a prison without bars, without trial, without conviction, but with the same hopelessness. In the long hours, of the wee hours of the morning, when the silence was louder than the loudspeaker announcements, Pablo would start thinking about everything he did not do. He never planned his departure well. He thought that by crossing the border and having someone to welcome him, everything would be solved. He thought that he would be able to work immediately, that he would not need to know English, that the papers would be something he would get later. He never considered the possibility of failure, and that, precisely, was what hurt him the most, to have been so naive. In Villavicencio, when he talked to others who had emigrated, he always heard the good stories, that after 6 months they already had a car, that they worked in restaurants and earned in dollars, that they sent money to Colombia every 2 weeks. Nobody talked about the real human cost, of those who disappeared at the border, of those who ended up in detention, of those who, like him, vanished in the corners of a city with no one. Illegal life was not just about hiding, it was not existing, not being able to ask for help, not being able to access a shelter, a hospital, a transportation card. It was being invisible to the system and too visible to those who feared the difference. One night, as he covered himself with a thin blanket and tried to sleep between 2 columns in Terminal 7, he overheard a conversation between 2 passengers sitting nearby. One older woman was telling another that she had seen a young Colombian man living at the airport, that she felt sorry for him, but that she was also afraid to go near him. Pablo listened to every word, without moving, without interrupting. He felt ashamed, not for what he was, but for what they thought he was. The next morning, he tried to find a new place to sleep. The cleaning staff already recognized him and began alerting security every time they saw him move in. At one of the terminals, a guard told him that if they saw him again, they would report him to immigration. Pablo just nodded and walked away. The cold was still a threat, hunger, a constant. But what was beginning to affect him most was the total loss of meaning. What had he come here for? What could he tell his mother if he managed to talk to her? How could he explain to her that, instead of working and sending money, he was sleeping in an airport, looking for food in the garbage and being treated like a criminal? More than once, it crossed his mind to surrender, find an officer and turn himself in, ask to be deported. At least there he had a roof over his head, a bed, his mother's voice. But every time that idea crossed his mind, so did the memory of Doña Claribel's gaze, the morning he left home, that mixture of faith and fear that only a mother knows how to hide. She could not go back like that, not after having promised her that everything was going to be all right. It was then that she understood something painful, but real. Crossing the border was not arriving. The real journey began later, and he was losing from the first step. But he was still breathing, and as long as he breathed, there was still something to do. Pablo's body no longer responded as before. He moved slowly, had trouble focusing his eyes, and sometimes had sudden dizziness that forced him to sit wherever he was. His skin was paler, dry, and his lips cracked from resisting the cold without water or protection. It had been 22 days since he had set foot in New York, and in that time, no one had offered him a real opportunity. Until that moment, it was at noon at Terminal 5, when his story took a little twist. He was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, with no energy, when a Latina woman in her 30s, well-dressed, with a folder in her hand and a determined attitude, approached him. Her name was Daniela, and she worked as a volunteer in an organization that helped immigrants in extreme situations. It was no coincidence. Someone, perhaps an airport employee, a passenger who had observed him silently, or even Marta, the cleaning lady, had reported her presence. "Are you the Colombian boy who lives here?" she asked cautiously, lowering her voice so as not to expose him. Pablo hesitated for a few seconds. He no longer knew who to trust. But her tone was different. It wasn't condescending or authoritarian. It was human. "Yes," he answered, barely audible. "My name is Pablo." Daniela sat down next to him, oblivious to the dirty floor and the stares of passers-by. She offered him a bottle of water, a cereal bar, and a tangerine. Pablo took them as if they were treasures. She didn't ask much at first. She let him eat calmly. Only after a few minutes, when he saw him calmer, he opened the folder he was carrying and took out a small notebook. "I work with a program that helps people like you. But I need you to tell me your story, complete, without omitting anything. Can you do it?" Pablo looked into her eyes. There was something in her gaze that didn't push him to defend or justify himself. She wasn't questioning him. She was listening to him. Then, for the first time in weeks, he spoke without fear. He told her everything. Since he left Villavicencio, what he had done to get to Mexico, how he crossed the border, how he was abandoned by Julian, the acquaintance who promised him work, and how he ended up sleeping in the parking lot of a 7-Eleven. He told her about Veronica and Luz Maria, how they helped him get to New York, the days living in the shadows of JFK, the hunger that no longer hurt because it became part of him, the failed attempt with the aid agency, and the constant fear of disappearing without a trace. Daniela listened to everything without interrupting. She just took notes, nodded, and at times pursed her lips as if holding back anger or sadness. When Pablo finished, there was no awkward silence. There was a real space, a deep respect for that account of struggle that was not read in any document. "Why don't you go back to Colombia?" he asked, gently. Pablo lowered his gaze. It was the first time someone had asked him a non-judgmental question. "There, I don't have anything either. My mother is sick. She lives alone. We don't even have a house of our own. I came because I wanted to help her, because I thought that here I could start over." Daniela put the folder away, got up slowly, and said something that gave him back a little spark he hadn't felt for a long time. "I won't promise you anything, but I won't leave you alone." She asked him for a phone number, but Pablo didn't have an active one. He only kept his old cell phone turned off, without SIM, which he used to not feel completely disconnected from the world. Daniela promised to come back. She told him she would talk to her team and they would try to find a solution. Before leaving, she left him something more important than food, a sincere look, direct, from someone who really saw him. That night, Pablo did not sleep. Not because of the cold, not because of hunger, but because, for the first time, someone knew his name. He was no longer just a body lying in an airport. Now it was Pablo, the young Colombian that someone had decided to listen to. 2 days after that encounter, Pablo saw Daniela again. This time she did not come alone. With her came 2 more people, Andres, a young man with short hair carrying a small camera, and Maria Elena, a social worker with a Central American accent. They were carrying a backpack with provisions, thermal blankets, and something that Pablo did not expect, a new cell phone with active line. They found it in the same place as always, between terminals 5 and 6, in a corner that Pablo had made his own, surrounded by clean cardboard that he changed every 2 days to avoid infections, and with an empty bottle that he used to carry water from the bathrooms. When he saw Daniela enter with those people, he felt something inside his chest rise up, something he had given up for dead. Hope. "I promised you," said Daniela, smiling, as she crouched down next to him. Pablo could not answer right away. His lips were parched, and his eyes were burning from all the sleeplessness. Daniela opened his backpack and handed him a bottle of water, some cookies, and then handed him his cell phone. "It's activated. You can receive calls, messages. You're already connected." "Really?" Pablo whispered, incredulous. "This is, for me, it's yours. And this is Andres. He's going to record your story so more people can know what you're going through. No one is going to show anything without your permission, but if you agree, we can try to get you support." Pablo hesitated for a few seconds, not out of distrust, but out of embarrassment. Telling his story, like this, in front of a camera, made him feel naked, exposed. But he also knew he didn't have many other options. He accepted. He nodded. They took him to an empty room that an airport supervisor let them use for half an hour. There, between 4 white walls and a plastic chair, Pablo sat facing forward. Andres adjusted the camera, Maria Elena jotted things down in a notebook, and Daniela sat right behind the lens. "Whenever you're ready, Pablo," she said. And then he spoke. It wasn't a polished speech. It was a confession. His voice cracked, his eyes were red, and he told everything again. But this time, from a deeper place, he spoke of the fear he felt crossing the Rio Grande, of how his legs shook when he realized Julian was never going to show up, of sleeping on the floor of a 7-Eleven, of the desperate choice to board a bus to nowhere just because 2 strangers gave him a chance, of the freezing nights at the airport, of the times he felt dead inside, and of the moments he believed he wouldn't see another dawn. But the hardest part came at the end. "I don't want to go back. Not because I don't love my country, but because I have no future there anymore. I came to this country looking for a chance. I didn't come to steal, or to hurt anyone, or to live off anybody. I just want to work, to have a hot meal, to be able to send something to my mom. She's sick. She lives in a little house that's falling apart. I want to help her. I want to make her proud of me, at least once. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance. Just one." Daniela watched him without blinking. Maria Elena's eyes were glassy. Andres stopped recording and slowly lowered the camera. The silence in the room was as powerful as Pablo's voice, a silence laden with pain, but also with dignity. After a few minutes, Daniela approached him, hugged him gently, almost as if she were afraid he might break, and whispered in his ear, "Your story is going to reach the right people, I swear." That night, he no longer slept on the floor. Maria Elena had found him an emergency room in a temporary migrant shelter across the Bronx. It wasn't ideal. He shared the space with others whose stories were just as tough, but for the first time in 23 days, Pablo lay down in a bed, with sheets, under a roof, with the lights off, not the harsh glow of the airport. Before going to sleep, he called his mother on the new phone. When she heard his voice, she burst into tears. "Where are you, mijo?" "Are you okay?" "I'm alive, Mom, and I'm not alone anymore." And for the first time, Pablo cried too, but not from fear. He cried with relief. Pablo's video was posted on the organization's social media just 2 days after it was recorded. Daniela made sure the content was honest, human, and direct. No exaggerations or embellishments, just the truth, told so openly that no one could remain indifferent when they heard it. At first, the story was shared in local migrant aid groups, then on community pages for Latinos in the United States, and eventually it went viral. In less than 48 hours, hundreds of messages came in, people offering clothes, food, temporary housing, even job opportunities. Pablo's story became the face of a reality that many people knew about, but few wanted to confront. It was living proof that the failure of migration wasn't always due to irresponsibility, but rather to a system that wasn't designed for those who arrived with nothing. A woman named Cecilia, who owned a bakery in Queens, was one of the first to respond. She'd been an undocumented immigrant for years and knew Pablo's pain firsthand. She called the organization directly and offered him a job helping out in her kitchen, as well as an empty room in her home so he could sleep safely, at least until he got on his feet. "I can't change the world," she said, "but I can change someone's day. Today I want to change his." Pablo accepted the offer with a mixture of gratitude and fear. Fear of getting his hopes up again, of trusting and then falling once more. But he went. Accompanied by Daniela, he arrived at the bakery on a cold Tuesday afternoon. Cecilia greeted him with a clean apron and a smile that reminded him of his mother. She didn't ask about his past. She just showed him around the kitchen, the utensils, the room where he'd sleep, and the daily routine. "We work hard here," she said, winking, "but we eat well too." Pablo started his new job the next day. At first, he struggled to keep up. His body was still weak, his reflexes slow. But with each passing day, he felt stronger. He woke up early, helped prepare the bread, swept, cleaned, and washed trays. Sometimes his feet ached at the end of the day, but it was a pain he didn't mind. The pain of hard work was better than the pain of misery. During his first week, he ate the same meals as the rest of the team, sitting around a simple table, surrounded by flour, ovens, and good people. At night, he slept deeply. No noise, no sudden awakenings, no guards telling him to move. The phone they'd given him wouldn't stop ringing. People in Colombia who had seen his video, old neighbors, distant relatives, and of course, his mother. Now they talked every day. Pablo told her that he was working, that he was eating well, that he'd even learned how to bake bread. She laughed on the other end of the phone with that trembling laugh of someone who was also surviving from a distance. One night, as they were closing the bakery, Cecilia approached him. "Can I ask you something, Pablo?" "Sure. Do you still want to stay in this country?" Pablo took a deep breath before answering, "Yes. I want to build something here, not for me anymore, for my mom, so that she never has to go without again." Cecilia nodded in silence. Then she told him she knew a lawyer who helped migrants in special situations, and that maybe they could find a legal way for him to remain. Nothing was certain, but he wasn't alone anymore. Weeks later, Pablo was still working at the bakery. His story had become a symbol for many. Some called him the airport guy. Others recognized him by his soft voice and the shy way he said, "Thank you." But for him, it didn't matter what people called him. What mattered was not being invisible anymore. He'd started from the bottom, the cold floor, the garbage bags, the hunger. But now, even though he still didn't have papers, and he was still living day to day, he had something he'd never known before: stability, and most importantly, hope. One morning, as he was arranging trays fresh out of the oven, Cecilia walked up to him and said casually, You know something, Pablo. You're not here by accident. You were meant to endure. And the ones who endure, they're the ones who change their story. Pablo smiled for the first time in a long time, not just with his mouth, but with his eyes. Because in the end, it wasn't just one opportunity that saved him. It was the sum of many small acts of kindness, plus his own decision not to give up, no matter how many times the world turned its back on him. And if you like this story, you'll surely love the next one that's about to appear on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and turn on notifications. See you next time.